Today is Matthew 11, verses 2 through 11. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus answered them, Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is he who takes no offense at me. As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out into the wilderness to behold? A reed shaken by the wind? Why then did you go out? To see a man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, those who wear soft raiment are in kings' houses. Why then did you go out? To see a prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, who shall prepare thy way before thee. Truly I say to you, among those born of women there has risen no one greater than John the Baptist, yet he is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Joy. Joy is discovering that even though I wasn't there to watch it, that Army could end 14 years of Navy tyranny in the Army-Navy game last night. I knew I would get at least one cheer, and I was praying for a lot of tolerant laughter. Never in 100 years would I have expected that I would move to Navy Central and for the first time in my adult life really experience Army actually winning. That brings me such great joy that I know not what to do with it. Now that's the tolerance I was expecting from this crowd. I struggled with this week as I thought about what it is to talk about joy during the season of Advent. In many ways, it's not an idea with which we are not familiar. It's something that we feel well up within us in moments that touch us in joyous ways. But joy around Advent seems to take on this kind of abstract feeling. The joy of salvation is perhaps something that's harder to feel and embody because we celebrate this through the year round. We embrace that story of God's redemption as the core tenet of our faith. It's not something in which we might necessarily respond with joy. It's something that we hold on to as a core article of our belief. So how does one embody something that perhaps we don't feel? Perhaps it feels more idea, more head, and less heart. I surprisingly found myself drawn to a story from my own past that I had not expected to come forth during the season of Advent. 8 years ago, I had the pleasure and the privilege of traveling with some other seminarians, other disciples, to Bosnia, along with Week of Compassion. And the point of the trip being to go and visit the country to see the work that Week of Compassion and its partners does on the ground. I spent 8 days there with students from our other seminaries and divinity houses, and it was It was an absolutely amazing experience to see the ways in which the good news was being shared, to see how our week of compassion gifts are put to work on the ground. And yet, there were other moments as well. With time, I have lost the specifics, and with the move, I have misplaced my notes. So I can't be precise. But I remember that it was toward the end of the trip, and we were traveling in the northwestern part of Bosnia. And we went off the main path and were taken to this small villa, maybe a dozen-ish homes in the area, farming community, but far from major village and kind of off by itself. And we arrived there noticing it was conspicuously absent of activity. But yet we pulled up to a house and we were greeted there by a family who welcomed us in. And come to find out, they were a family who had benefited through our work in Week of Compassion. This village had been occupied by ethnic Serb families. But being in the northwestern part of Bosnia, which is near the Croatian border, when the wars erupted, as the Croatian armies poured in, all of these Serbian ethnic families fled to Serbia itself, fearing for their life. As we know, this was a war in the former Yugoslavia of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and they were right to flee. The goal of the advancing Croatian armies was to drive them out and to bring Croatian families to take over their homes instead. We were there in 2008. Almost 14 years after the end of the conflict, and we met with this family, which was one of two families in that entire little hamlet who had finally come back to their home from Serbia after the war. 14 years later, and only two families had returned, and they hadn't even been there for 2 years yet. These homes had been left abandoned. It's amazing that they were in the condition they were, considering that there was no one around for such a long time. It was through our assistance and others that they were able to come back and start again. Off the grid, they had a gas generator that they would fire up to occasionally listen to the radio. The soccer games were a big deal for them. And to charge their cell phones, because there was no phone service either. All of those lines had been destroyed during the wars. And we spoke with them in their living room through an interpreter. We shared stories, we answered questions to one another, and they did something incredible. They began to prepare a meal. And they brought us in, and they sat us down around their table, and they fed us. It wasn't much. It was some concoction, a recipe that I didn't get, may have gotten lost in the translation if I had. But it was potatoes and greens that had been boiled and stewed together. And I don't know how they seasoned them, and I wish they did. It was absolutely delicious. And it wasn't until I had gone through a few bites that I realized we were the ones who were eating. The family was not eating themselves. They were serving us. And none of us paused to ask, because we dare not question the hospitality. But how was this cutting into their ability to have their own meal that night? It was incredibly touching for a number of reasons, that alone being one, but the elder of the family, I swear he reminded me so much of my maternal grandfather when he was younger. My grandfather, when I was about 5, he was a spitting image. It was such a strange encounter. And I remember having a moment that struck me as so bizarre, where my grandfather's look-alike said a few words, and he was smiling at us. And our translator shared that he had said, "You know, I can't believe that you all came all the way from the States to see us." And I thought about that for a moment. I thought about everything we had done in the days prior, that we still had another 2 days left in country, and I thought, well, We didn't come here just to see you. This was part of our schedule. In my mind, I'm even going, I didn't even know we were going to see you. This was just where they brought us. But it obviously brought him great joy to think that these ministers in training had come all the way from the United States to be their guests as they fed us. I had no idea what that meant at the time. It wasn't until later that I realized that we had offered them an incredible gift without even trying. That just by being there, to be their guests, to receive their hospitality, to be a symbol to which they could offer thanks for the support and help they had received, and to feel the touch of people who cared from halfway across the world, brought them joy. And that alone meant we had come all the way from the States just to visit them. I have thought about that because at the time I didn't recognize what was going on. And our reading from Isaiah today, another story of God's holy mountain, of making a path and a way in the desert. We talked about the way on which there would be no crime, there would be no robbers, no predators, that all would walk safely on the way. I was drawn to the line that there are no fools on God's way, because I realized that in my sojourn through Bosnia, I was walking God's way, and I was the fool. I had no idea what I was there to offer. And yet, through my naivete, my innocence, my complete lack of understanding, God did something amazing. God allowed 6 seminary students to minister to a family to whom we couldn't even speak directly without a translator. And I don't think any of us even knew we were doing it. I love that thought, that idea that on God's way there are no fools, because fool though I was transformed into a gift for someone else without even knowing it. I was able to incarnate joy for someone and not even realize what it was that I had accomplished. I seldom get through that story without losing it along the way. And it looks like I'm not going to today either, so. But I thought of our return once again to John the Baptist as well, and his desperation, if you will, his concern that as he had become captive, that perhaps his message was for naught, that he was not accomplishing something good. So he sent his followers out with questions for Jesus. Are you the one? And Jesus' answer is beautiful. Tell him what you see. Are the sick being healed? Are the poor being ministered to? Are those in jail being comforted? What is it that you see? And then when John's followers left, he turned to the crowd. So for those of you who went looking for John, what did you expect? A king? A nobleman? Someone dressed in purple robes of great wealth? Is that who you went to hear? Did you just go to hear some firebrand? Some half-crazed guy who'd lived and starved himself in the desert? A stalk blowing in the wind? Did you go to hear a prophet? Perhaps did you hear the words of a prophet? A messenger who was sent to proclaim God's good news? John's call was not to be the good news, but to proclaim it. He says so himself in so many ways. I have come to proclaim the way of the one who is to come after me. And yet we know that in his presence, people experienced a touch of the divine. In his presence, people felt the coming of God, even if he was saying God is not yet here. They felt something happen. They felt a spirit move amongst them.
That's right.
They felt good news. On God's way, there are no fools. All of us who foolishly wander the path are transformed into something greater and something more because we become the embodiment of good news just by our presence and our willingness to share with those around us. By being willing to sit down in the home of complete strangers in the middle of Bosnia, I became a deliverer of good news and I didn't even know it. I thought I was the one who was being ministered to. My grandfather's look-alike was sure that he was the one who was being ministered to. I think there's something to be said about that. That joy is incarnated in the presence of two or more who find themselves gathered in the name of the one who is holy. And joy is incarnated not because we understand or we do it out of some altruistic nature or because we have felt the call. We incarnate joy to one another without even knowing that we have done so. Yes, like John, we have the ability to be prophets, to be those who proclaim the good news, the coming presence of God, because we bring it with us. That's right. We don't just go alone before God. We go forward with God. And we bring that presence with us even in the moments that we cannot know. I told you I don't know how to talk about the joy of salvation, the joy of this idea that is so much bigger than ourselves, the idea that all creation may yet be redeemed. And yet, there is something joyous about knowing that in that moment, seminarians from the United States, ethnic Serbs in the far northwest corner of Bosnia, sat together and incarnated joy in a very human and personal and real way for one another. Being present in Christ's name is what we are called to do and how we are called to live. And the joy of the season of Advent and the coming of God is knowing even when we don't have the answers, even when we don't understand what it is that we can bring, God will bring it for us and with us and through us. So let us embrace that gift and be generous in spirit as we embrace one another, for we know not when we will become the hands and feet of Christ for our neighbors around us. We know not when, in moments of confusion for ourselves, we may become the embodiment of joy for someone else. We know not when, even in those times when imprisoned though we may feel, we may be the proclamation of good news for someone who needs to hear it. So let us embrace the joy of our salvation as we embrace the joy that we encounter in spelling out and sharing that story of redemption with one another. Let us make that our calling. Let us make that our gift as we prepare ourselves for the coming of Christ and to become Christ for others. Amen.